I never imagined that my entire life could collapse in the span of a single sentence spoken in a sterile office that smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. The lawyer's voice was calm, practiced, almost detached as he adjusted his glasses and unfolded the document with deliberate care. My hands were clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white, and yet my heart was pounding so violently I thought the whole room could hear it. My parents sat to my left, my father in his navy suit and my mother in her pale gray dress, both of them wearing the kind of expressions that said they were merely enduring an inconvenience rather than facing a life-altering event. To my right, my younger brother Jacob lounged back in his chair, his designer watch flashing under the fluorescent lights, his lips already tugging into a smirk as though he knew something I did not. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the will, the document that was supposed to be the great equalizer, the moment that decades of sacrifice and silent loyalty would finally be acknowledged. I leaned forward, every muscle in my body tense, bracing myself for whatever came next. And then I heard it. The words that cracked like a whip across my skin. To my daughter, Monica Hayes, I leave nothing. Nothing. The syllables echoed in the room, bounced off the wooden panels, and lodged themselves deep in my chest like shards of glass. I stared at the lawyer, certain I had misheard, certain he had skipped a line or stumbled over a phrase, because surely no parent would write their child out of existence so completely. But he continued without hesitation, his voice steady, his eyes betraying no surprise. To my son, Jacob Hayes, I leave everything. The estate, the properties, the business shares the accounts. Everything. My world tilted. My lungs seized. It was as if the floor had given way beneath me, and I was free falling into a darkness I had not even known was waiting. My brother exhaled a sharp laugh, low and triumphant, and when I turned toward him, I saw a look that made my stomach twist. It was not relief, not gratitude. It was victory. A smirk curled across his face, smug and cruel, the kind of expression that told me this had been planned, orchestrated, and savored long before the words were read aloud. My father's jaw was tight, but his eyes held no regret. My mother actually had the audacity to smile thin and satisfied, as though the decision had finally set things right in her mind. And in that moment, I realized with a clarity so cold it burned that I had never been their daughter in the way Jacob had always been their son. To them, I had been useful, reliable, the steady hand that kept the family from collapsing under the weight of Jacob's failures. I had been the quiet source of money, the one who signed checks, paid bills, and carried burdens without complaint. I had been a resource, not a child, a solution, not a daughter. And now, after years of giving, I was left with nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears, my vision blurred with the sting of unshed tears. But beneath the rising tide of humiliation, there was something else, something sharper and more dangerous. Rage. Pure, searing rage that coursed through my veins and ignited a fire I had spent years smothering. They thought they could erase me with a single line in a will. They thought they could discard me like a worn-out tool, toss me aside after draining me dry. But as the weight of betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. They had stripped me of everything they could, but in doing so, they had also freed me from the last illusion I had clung to. I no longer had a family. I had enemies, and enemies could be fought. Enemies could be destroyed. My hands unclenched my nails, leaving small crescent moons in my palms, and I forced myself to sit up straighter. If they wanted war, then war was what they would get. The lawyer's voice faded into the background, Jacob's laughter grated against my ears, and my parents' smug faces burned into my memory like brands. I would remember this moment forever. The moment when the people who had raised me revealed they had never loved me, only used me. The moment when the truth finally shattered the lies I had built my life around. The moment when Monica Hayes was left with nothing, and yet in that nothingness discovered a resolve stronger than anything I had ever known. My name is Monica Hayes, and I am 31 years old, and if anyone were to look at me from the outside, they would probably describe me as successful, independent, and resilient. The kind of woman who built her life brick by brick without anyone holding the ladder. I run a small but thriving interior design firm in Dallas, Texas, a business that started out of my cramped one-bedroom apartment with little more than a borrowed laptop, a second-hand drafting table, and the relentless belief that I could create beauty from chaos. Clients now wait weeks to get a consultation with me, and I have contracts that keep the lights on and my employees paid. But behind the polished website and professional smile, there is a history that most people would never suspect, a history carved from years of sacrifice and silence, where every step forward I took for myself was weighted down by the chains of my family's expectations. I grew up as the oldest child in a household that looked perfect on the surface. My father managing a chain of mid-level restaurants, my mother always impeccably dressed and eager to present the image of a woman who had it all together, and my younger brother Jacob, who from the moment he entered the world was treated like a miracle. My earliest memories are colored by the subtle imbalance that ran through our home. The way my parents' voices softened when they spoke to Jacob, the way their eyes lit up at his smallest achievements, while I was expected to excel quietly, to be dependable, to carry the burdens without fanfare. I was the child who got straight A's, who learned to cook dinners when my mother was too tired, who watched Jacob with patience when my parents went out. Yet no matter how much I achieved, the spotlight was never mine to stand in. That belonged to Jacob. As we grew older, the divide became sharper, almost painful to watch. Jacob was celebrated for mediocrity trophies for participation lined his shelves, while I was scolded for bringing home a 94 instead of a 100. My father would ruffle Jacob's hair and call him the future of the family, while glancing at me with eyes that said my worth was measured not in love, but in utility. My mother would gush over Jacob's drawing of a stick figure while flipping through my scholarship acceptance letters as if they were utility bills. Even as a child, I learned that my place was not to shine, but to support, not to be nurtured, but to be useful. I swallowed that bitter lesson and told myself that if I worked hard enough, built something solid enough, maybe then they would finally see me. But that recognition never came. Instead, what came was responsibility, an endless list of sacrifices that piled higher with each passing year. When I was 16, Jacob crashed the family car into a neighbor's fence, and my parents demanded that I use my part-time job savings to help pay for repairs. When I was 19, I was told to sign my name as guarantor on a small loan because Jacob was too young, and when I protested, my father's words cut me in half. Family takes care of family. Monica, stop being selfish. At 22, I worked 2 jobs to cover my tuition at the University of Texas, while Jacob dropped out of college after a semester of parties and hangovers. They shrugged it off, told everyone he was just finding his path. Meanwhile, my path was clear to shoulder, to provide, to endure. Outwardly, I became the woman who could handle anything the one relatives admired during holidays because I was so together, but inwardly, I carried the unspoken knowledge that my achievements were invisible, that no matter how high I climbed, it would never be high enough to eclipse Jacob's failures. That was the foundation of my identity within this family. Not daughter, not equal, but resource. And so by the time I sat in that lawyer's office, I had already been conditioned to expect less, to accept scraps of recognition, while Jacob feasted on unearned praise. Yet even with all of that, I had still held on to the smallest hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That hope was crushed in seconds. Looking back now, I can see the pattern had been there all along, woven into the fabric of my childhood so tightly that for years I mistook it for normal, as though favoritism was simply another family tradition we never spoke about but always lived by. Our house on Willow Creek Drive was modest but well kept with a lawn. My father insisted I mow every Saturday, while Jacob sprawled on the couch with video games, claiming he had homework he never touched. My parents did not scold him. They laughed, ruffled his hair, and told me not to nag my brother. I remember one Christmas when I was 9 and Jacob was 7. I unwrapped a stack of books my mother said would help me stay ahead in school, while Jacob tore through the paper to reveal a brand new bicycle, red and gleaming with a silver bow. He rode it around the block while I stood holding my new dictionary set, smiling politely, because that was what was expected. The neighbors cheered for him, and my parents waved proudly from the porch. No one noticed the tears I swallowed as I turned the thin pages of words I already knew. Birthdays were the same story. On my 12th birthday, I asked for a simple silver bracelet, something delicate to remind me that I mattered as a girl, but instead I got a prepaid calculator for my upcoming algebra class. On Jacob's 10th birthday, my parents threw him a party at the skating rink, rented out the whole place, invited every classmate he had, and bought him a gold chain he wore proudly to school. When I asked why my birthday was different, my father said in a tone that brooked no argument, "Because Jacob needs to build his confidence. Monica, you're already strong enough." I told myself that strength was a compliment, but deep down it felt like a punishment, as though my very resilience was the excuse they used to neglect me. School years only made the favoritism sharper. I joined the debate team, won regional competitions, and once even got my photo in the local paper, holding a trophy almost as tall as me. My parents cut the article out and placed it in a drawer. Never framed, it never mentioned it again. When Jacob scored a single touchdown in a junior high football game, my father hosted a barbecue and invited the entire neighborhood to celebrate. He grilled steaks and bragged about Jacob's athletic potential, while I sat at the picnic table with my untouched plate, invisible in plain sight. Teachers noticed the imbalance too. Mrs. Connolly, my 8th grade English teacher, once pulled me aside and said, "You deserve more recognition at home. Monica, but don't let that stop you." Her words were kind, but they also stung because they confirmed what I already knew. My parents saw Jacob's smallest sparks as fireworks, while my fire burned unnoticed. High school was the clearest mirror of all. I maintained a 4.0 GPA, applied for scholarships, worked weekends at a diner to save for college, while Jacob coasted on excuses. He skipped classes, failed math twice, and when he finally scraped by with a C, my parents took him out to dinner to celebrate his improvement. When I questioned the double standard, my mother pursed her lips and said, "Your brother needs encouragement. You don't. You've always managed on your own." That phrase became the refrain of my adolescence. "You've always managed on your own," as if independence was a gift I had been born with, and therefore they were free to withhold their care. The favoritism seeped into every corner of our lives, from the way my father handed Jacob the car keys without hesitation while warning me to take the bus, to the way my mother praised Jacob's messy attempts at cooking while critiquing every detail of the dinners I prepared. I became the background music to his solo performance, reliable, constant, taken for granted. And though I told myself that one day things would balance out, that adulthood would even the scales, I carried the quiet ache of those years with me like a scar under the skin. What I did not know then, what I could not have imagined, was how those early patterns of favoritism would grow into betrayals so large they would nearly destroy me. As I grew older, the favoritism that once showed itself in gifts and parties hardened into something heavier, a system of expectations that weighed on me like chains I could not break, and those chains were forged almost entirely from money. My parents rarely asked Jacob to contribute or sacrifice. Instead, they turned to me time and time again as if I were not their daughter, but their insurance policy. When I was 18, ready to leave for college, I discovered that while Jacob's tuition had been set aside in a dedicated fund, my college savings had been quietly drained to cover one of his failed ventures. He had convinced my parents to co-sign a loan for a car flipping business, a scheme he abandoned after 6 months, leaving behind nothing but debt. The fund my grandparents had once created for me was gone, and my parents looked at me with expectation rather than apology. "You'll manage, Monica." My father said those words again, like a whip crack. And so, I did manage. I worked double shifts at a diner, slept 3 or 4 hours a night, and still showed up to class with my assignments complete. I took out loans in my own name, thousands upon thousands of dollars that I would spend years repaying, while Jacob coasted on my parents' generosity and took weekend trips to Las Vegas with friends. At 21, Jacob decided he wanted to open a boutique gym. He had no experience, no plan, but my parents mortgaged part of their house to give him startup capital. The business folded in less than a year, leaving unpaid bills and creditors circling. That was when my parents came to me again, asking me to lend Jacob $10,000 to help him get back on his feet. I remember the way my mother clasped my hands, her voice trembling as she said, "He just needs one more chance." Against my better judgment, against the knot of anger in my stomach, I wrote the check. That one more chance turned into another failure and then another. By 25, I had given my brother more than $45,000 money I could have invested in my business in my future, but instead was funneled into his reckless pursuits. When my mother was hospitalized for surgery, I paid the bill my parents could not cover. When the roof of their house caved in after a storm, I dipped into my savings to pay for repairs. Every emergency, every crisis, every shortfall somehow became mine to solve. My parents praised Jacob for his entrepreneurial spirit while treating my sacrifices as obligations. No one asked how many nights I cried into my pillow, wondering why I was always the safety net. No one asked what dreams I had to postpone, so Jacob could chase another illusion. The worst blow came when I discovered my name had been forged on a bank loan for one of Jacob's ventures. I had never signed those papers, but there was my name in black ink tied to a debt of $15,000. When I confronted my parents, my father avoided my eyes and muttered that it must have been a mistake. Jacob smirked, shrugged, and said, "Don't be so dramatic, you'll pay it off faster than anyone else." And they expected me to accept it, to bear it quietly as I always had. That was the moment something inside me began to crack, though I buried it beneath layers of duty. I kept working, kept paying, kept holding the family together even as resentment burned like acid in my veins. By the time I turned 31, I had built my own company from scratch, was finally seeing real success, but still, my parents treated me like a bottomless well they could draw from whenever Jacob stumbled. What I did not know was that every sacrifice, every loan, every bill I covered was leading to a final betrayal so monumental it would rip away the last illusions I held about family and leave me standing alone in that lawyer's office, stripped of everything except the rage to fight back. The day of the will reading arrived with a heaviness I could not shake, as though the air itself had thickened around me, pressing down on my chest with each breath. I drove to the lawyer's office in silence, the hum of the engine barely masking the roar of thoughts in my head. Part of me clung stubbornly to hope, whispering that perhaps this would finally be the moment where all of my sacrifices were acknowledged, that my parents would balance the scales with fairness. The other part of me, colder and sharper, warned that hope had betrayed me before. The office itself was imposing, a tall glass building downtown with polished marble floors that clicked under my heels as I walked toward the reception desk. The secretary smiled politely, but her eyes flicked over me with curiosity, as if she already knew the storm about to unfold. I was escorted into a conference room with dark wood paneling and a long table that stretched out like a battlefield. My father sat at one end, posture rigid, his fingers drumming impatiently against the surface. My mother sat beside him, lips painted pearls around her neck, her face arranged into that familiar mask of calm superiority. Jacob slouched across from them, scrolling on his phone, designer sunglasses perched carelessly in his hair. When he looked up and saw me, he smirked as though this was his coronation and I was merely an unwanted guest. I took my seat, spine straight, hands folded tightly in my lap, determined not to let them see the tremor running through me. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with a voice as smooth as stone, entered with a folder tucked under his arm. He offered the perfunctory condolences, though my parents barely nodded, and then he began to read. At first, the words were formal routine, a recitation of property addresses and bank accounts. My heart pounded harder with each passing second, waiting for the line that would secure my place in this family's legacy. And then it came the sentence that detonated like a bomb. To my daughter Monica Hayes, I leave nothing. The word nothing seemed to stretch, echoing in my ears, each letter slamming into me like a fist. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, staring at the lawyer as though he had made a mistake, as though he would correct himself with the next line. But instead, he continued steady and relentless. To my son, Jacob Hayes, I leave everything. The estate, the properties, the business shares, the accounts. Everything. My vision blurred. My stomach twisted violently and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. I forced myself to look at my parents, searching for any flicker of remorse, any sign that this was not as cruel as it sounded. My father's eyes were cold, unwavering, his jaw set with a conviction that told me this had been his decision all along. My mother's lips curled into the faintest smile, satisfied, almost smug. And Jacob leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh, low and triumphant, a sound that sliced through me with surgical precision. "Guess I'm the chosen one after all," he said softly, just loud enough for me to hear. My nails dug into my palms, crescent moons forming in my skin, and heat rushed to my face as humiliation burned through me. Years of sacrifice, years of carrying this family on my back, reduced to nothing more than a discarded line in a legal document. My parents had not only erased me from their legacy, they had done so deliberately, unapologetically, as if I had never mattered. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me, crushing, suffocating, and yet beneath it something stirred, something darker and more dangerous than despair. Rage. Pure, unfiltered rage that pulsed through my veins, igniting every nerve. In that instant, I knew the truth with a clarity that was almost blinding. I was not their daughter. I had never been. I had been their safety net, their problem solver, their endless resource, but never their equal. They had chosen Jacob again and again, and now they had written it into permanence. But if they thought this was the end of me, they were wrong. The will was not the end. It was the spark. I sat taller, swallowed the scream clawing at my throat, and etched every detail into my memory. The lawyer's calm voice, Jacob's smug grin, my mother's satisfied smile, my father's cold eyes. This was the moment the last illusion shattered, the moment I stopped waiting for love that would never come. They had left me nothing, but in doing so, they had given me everything I needed. A reason to fight. In the days after the will reading, the betrayal unfolded, layer by layer, like a wound that refused to close, each discovery cutting deeper than the last. At first, I told myself perhaps my parents had been misguided, that maybe they believed Jacob needed the inheritance more than I did, because I had built a business because I could survive on my own. That was the lie I wanted to cling to, the last shred of hope that they had not deliberately set out to erase me. But then the evidence began to surface ugly truths that left no room for misinterpretation. I went through old bank records papers I had kept out of habit more than suspicion and found trail after trail of money I had given them that had quietly funneled into Jacob's pockets. That $10,000 I had been told went to pay down medical bills had instead been used to cover Jacob's overdue credit cards. The $15,000 loan I supposedly co-signed had been entirely Jacob's debt, my name forged in his crooked handwriting so my credit would take the hit instead of his. Even the roof repairs on the house I had paid for had been exaggerated, the contractor confirming that half the funds had been redirected into a down payment on Jacob's luxury car. My chest tightened as the realization hit me in full force. Not only had my parents chosen Jacob in the will, they had been choosing him all along, using me as the silent financier for his reckless life. Every sacrifice I made, every night I stayed up working to cover another bill, had been twisted into another lifeline for my brother. And the worst part was that they never intended to tell me. They had lied with straight faces, thanked me with hollow words, and then turned around and called me selfish when I dared to question. The final blow came when I confronted Jacob one evening at his apartment, a sleek place filled with furniture he could not have afforded on his own. He opened the door with that same smirk plastered on his face and leaned against the frame as if welcoming me into enemy territory. "Why are you so surprised?" he drawled when I demanded answers, waving his hand as though the forgery and the lies were inconveniences. "You've always had money, Monica. You've always managed. This is how family works. You take care of me because you can." His words sent a shiver down my spine, not because they were new, but because they echoed everything my parents had ever told me. He had absorbed their mantra, twisted it into his weapon, and now wielded it without shame. When I turned to my parents for an explanation, they did not deny it. My father crossed his arms and said firmly, "Your brother needed help. You had the ability. End of story." My mother touched my shoulder, her eyes unyielding, and said, "You're strong, Monica. We knew you could handle it. Jacob couldn't." The calmness in their voices was worse than anger. It was indifference, as though my pain was irrelevant, as though my sacrifices were never mine to give but theirs to command. In that moment, the betrayal crystallized into something undeniable. They had not only stripped me from the will they had stolen from me for years, conspired with Jacob to drain me dry while smiling in my face. The daughter who had given everything had been rewarded with nothing but contempt. And it was then, standing in my childhood kitchen with my parents dismissing me and Jacob laughing at me, that a new clarity surged through me like fire. They thought they had broken me, thought I would slink away in silence as I always had. But they had underestimated the very strength they used as their excuse. The truth was out now, and once the truth is exposed, it cannot be buried again. They had betrayed me completely, and that betrayal would become the weapon I used to bring them down. The night after confronting my family, I sat alone in my apartment with the blinds drawn and the weight of years pressing down on me, but beneath the crushing ache of betrayal, there was a current of fury too strong to ignore. I knew I could not keep playing the role they had written for me, the dutiful daughter who bled quietly while Jacob squandered everything. If they saw me as nothing more than a resource, then I would use every resource at my disposal to fight back. I pulled out every folder, every receipt, every email, and began piecing together the trail of exploitation they had left behind. Bank transfers with Jacob's name, contracts with forged signatures, text messages from my mother asking for money under false pretenses. The more I laid out the evidence, the more the pattern became undeniable, and with it came a grim sense of power. They had left me with nothing, but they had also left me with proof. I contacted a lawyer of my own, a sharp woman named Angela Carter, who listened without flinching as I told her everything. She leaned back in her chair, tapped a pen against her notepad, and said words that sent a jolt through me. "You have a case. Forgery, fraud, misappropriation. This is not just betrayal. Monica, this is criminal." For the first time in years, I felt the ground shift under my feet, not into darkness, but into solid stone. I was no longer begging for recognition. I was building a weapon. Angela advised me to cut off every channel they used to drain me. So that night, I canceled the automatic transfers, closed joint accounts, and froze access to anything they could touch. When Jacob called the next morning, demanding to know why his rent payment had bounced, I let the phone ring until it went silent, a small victory that tasted sweeter than I expected. But I did not stop there. I compiled the evidence into organized binders, each page, a record of the theft they had committed under the guise of family, and I sent copies to the extended relatives who had always believed the illusion my parents created. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them received the truth in black and white, undeniable and damning. The fallout was immediate. My phone buzzed with shocked messages, relatives demanding explanations, some expressing sympathy, others promising that my parents and Jacob would answer for what they had done. And then came the confrontation I had both dreaded and longed for. My father showed up at my office, storming past the receptionist with Jacob at his heels, both of them radiating fury. My father's voice thundered as he accused me of destroying the family, of airing dirty laundry, of being ungrateful. Jacob sneered, called me bitter, pathetic, claimed I was jealous of his inheritance. I stood behind my desk, hands steady, and for once I did not shrink. I looked them both in the eye and said with a calmness I barely recognized, "You took my money, my trust, and now my inheritance. You used me until there was nothing left. But I am not your victim anymore. I am your reckoning." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Jacob's angry scoff and my father's clenched fists. They left, slamming the door, but I knew the war had begun. Within weeks, Angela filed the lawsuit, and suddenly, Jacob's smirk was replaced by pale anxiety. His accounts were investigated, the forged documents subpoenaed, and the inheritance he flaunted was frozen pending the outcome. The man who had once laughed in my face was now drowning in legal bills, scrambling for footing he no longer had. My parents called, begged, then threatened, then begged again, but I held my ground. For every guilt-laced word they hurled at me, I repeated the truth. Family does not mean exploitation. Love does not mean theft. And in fighting back, I felt something I had not felt in years: freedom. The chains they had wrapped around me were breaking link by link, and with every step I took to expose them, I reclaimed a piece of myself they thought they had buried. They wanted me silent, erased, forgotten. Instead, I was louder than ever, armed with truth, with law, with the resolve of someone who had nothing left to lose. and for the first time, that made me dangerous. The consequences came faster than I ever imagined, a tidal wave that crashed down on my family with relentless force once the lawsuit was filed and the truth began to circulate beyond the walls of our home. Jacob, who had strutted through life as if he were untouchable, suddenly found himself drowning in legal trouble he could not charm his way out of. His accounts were frozen, his assets tied up, and the flashy lifestyle he had paraded on social media evaporated overnight. The luxury car was repossessed, the apartment he bragged about was locked, when he could not cover the rent, and his so-called friends who once clung to him for free dinners and parties vanished the moment the money stopped flowing. I watched from a distance as the smirk that had always decorated his face dissolved into panic, his phone calls becoming more desperate until eventually they stopped altogether. My parents did not escape unscathed either. For years, they had built their reputation on the image of a respectable couple, owners of successful restaurants, pillars of the community, but once relatives and neighbors saw the evidence I shared, that image cracked beyond repair. Whispers spread at church customers stopped coming to the restaurants, and soon their business faltered under the weight of scandal. The extended family that once gathered at their home for holidays began holding dinners without them, their invitations quietly revoked, their phone calls ignored. The shame they had tried to bury in me was now theirs to carry. I will never forget the day I saw my father outside the courthouse after a preliminary hearing. His shoulders, once so broad and commanding, were slumped under the weight of defeat, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. My mother clung to his arm, her pearls long pawned, her carefully painted smile replaced by bitterness. They looked smaller, somehow diminished, and when they spotted me, they froze as if facing a ghost they had tried to erase. My father opened his mouth, but no words came. My mother whispered my name, almost pleading, but I walked past them without stopping. For the first time in my life, I owed them nothing. The fallout did not stop with financial ruin. Jacob was indicted for forgery and fraud, and though his lawyer tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding, the mountain of evidence was undeniable. He pled down to avoid prison, but even with a deal, his record was permanently stained. No respectable company would hire him, and the inheritance he thought would secure his future remained locked in legal limbo, much of it already swallowed by restitution and court fees. The man who once mocked me for being responsible was now left with nothing but debts he could never repay. Friends who had once cheered his recklessness now avoided him like a disease, and even my parents, once his fiercest defenders, began to turn on him in whispers of blame. At family gatherings, the story of what they had done became legend, a cautionary tale told in hushed voices over dinner tables. Relatives who once envied Jacob now shook their heads in pity, and some even offered me quiet words of support, as if finally seeing the truth they had ignored for so long. There was a bitter satisfaction in knowing that justice long delayed had finally arrived. But it was not just about revenge. It was about balance, about breaking the cycle that had trapped me since childhood. The fallout stripped them of the illusion of control, forced them to face the world not as the proud parents of a golden son, but as accomplices to theft and deception. And while their world crumbled, mine grew steadier. I no longer feared their phone calls, no longer flinched at their demands, because I had proven to myself and to them that I was not powerless. They had underestimated me, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. The consequences were theirs to bear, and I carried no guilt in watching them fall. When the dust of the legal battles and public fallout finally began to settle, I found myself standing in a space I had never known before, a life that was wholly my own, unchained from the constant weight of my family's demands. At first, the quiet was strange, almost unnerving, because for so many years my phone had been filled with urgent texts and calls from my parents asking for money from Jacob, begging for another chance from creditors, hounding me about debts that were never mine. Now the silence was different. It was not empty, it was peaceful. I could walk into my apartment and breathe without the tension of anticipating another crisis. I poured myself into my business with a focus I had never been allowed before, and the results were astonishing. Contracts expanded, clients recommended me to others, and within a year, I moved my firm into a bright new office, downtown sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, a space that felt like a physical representation of freedom. For the first time, every dollar I earned belonged to me, and every choice I made was guided not by guilt or obligation, but by genuine desire. I bought myself a small townhouse, nothing extravagant but sturdy, with a garden where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the sunrise. Each time I turned the key in the door, I reminded myself that this place was mine, not tied to anyone else's failures or demands. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not just my life, but my sense of self. Therapy helped me untangle the knots of years of manipulation, helped me see that my worth had never been dependent on my family's approval. Friends who had once been kept at a distance by my exhaustion now became constants in my life, and I learned how to accept love and support without suspicion. I even opened my heart to the possibility of romance again cautiously at first, but eventually finding someone who valued me not for what I could provide, but for who I was. With him, there were no strings, no demands, only partnership and respect. It was a revelation to realize that love could feel like safety instead of servitude. My parents tried to reach out a few times, their voices softer now, almost pleading, but I knew better than to fall into the same cycle. I answered politely but firmly, establishing boundaries they could no longer cross. Jacob, too, attempted apologies thin and desperate, but by then his words meant nothing. He had been given everything and squandered it all while I had been given nothing and built a life from the ashes. The contrast spoke louder than any speech I could deliver. What surprised me most was how little I missed them once the ties were cut. For years I had believed that without their approval I would be lost, but instead I found that without their control I was free. The absence of their voices left room for my own, and in that space I discovered strength I had only glimpsed before. I traveled for the first time without guilt, standing on the cliffs of Ireland with the wind in my hair, and I thought of how impossible such a moment would have felt when I was chained to Jacob's failures. I looked at the ocean and whispered to myself, "You made it out." That was growth not in spite of the betrayal, but because of it. It had carved me raw, yes, but in the cracks, new life had grown stronger, unyielding. The resolution was not just in legal victories or financial independence, but in reclaiming my identity. I was no longer the invisible daughter, no longer the background supporter. I was Monica Hayes, and I was finally living a life defined by my own choices, my own boundaries, my own worth. Looking back now, I understand that what happened in that lawyer's office was not just the end of an inheritance. It was the end of an illusion I had carried all my life. The illusion that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, eventually my parents and my brother would see me, value me, choose me. They never did, and they never would, because their love was conditional, their loyalty selective, their respect non-existent. That revelation was devastating at first, like standing barefoot on shattered glass. But with time, it became liberating. I see now that betrayal can be the greatest teacher, that injustice can become the very spark that ignites transformation. For years, I thought family was defined by blood, by duty, by the ties you could not sever, no matter how much they strangled you. But now I know family is defined by respect, by trust, by reciprocity, and if those are absent, then blood alone is nothing more than coincidence. My parents chose Jacob not because he deserved it, but because they needed to protect their illusion of him, their fantasy of a golden son, and in doing so, they revealed who they truly were. Jacob chose himself over and over, using me as a crutch until the crutch broke and he collapsed. And I chose finally to walk away. That choice changed everything. It gave me boundaries. It gave me peace. It gave me the strength to redefine what love means. Love is not silent sacrifice. Love is not erasure. Love is not exploitation. True love, whether from family, friends, or a partner, is recognition, safety, mutual care. And once I understood that, I stopped chasing approval from those who would never give it and started building a circle of people who did. The consequences my family faced were theirs to bear, and I do not rejoice in their suffering, but I also do not shield them from it. Actions have consequences, and for once they are the ones paying the price. That is justice, not cruelty. And as for me, I carry no guilt. I carry lessons. I carry scars that have turned into armor. I carry the knowledge that survival is not enough, that I deserve to thrive. Sometimes I walk past the courthouse where my battle began, the building tall and cold against the sky, and I remember the girl who sat trembling in that conference room, hearing she had been left with nothing. I wish I could reach back and tell her that nothing was the soil from which everything would grow, that being left with nothing would force her to claim her own life, her own worth, her own freedom. That betrayal would become the road to empowerment. Now, when I wake up in the morning in a home that is mine, when I walk into a business I built with my own hands, when I laugh with friends who see me, when I hold the hand of a man who loves me without conditions, I feel the weight of those words again, but they no longer cut. To my daughter, I leave nothing. Those words no longer define me. They define the smallness of the people who wrote them. I am not the sum of what they withheld. I am the sum of what I created despite them. And that is everything. For the first time in my life, I am not surviving their betrayal. I am living on my own terms, and I will never allow anyone to write me out of my own story again.